Well, it's time to do a little bit of a show and tell on our chicken coops and what we have going on at the moment, and kind of walk through some things that we have, I guess, built into the coops that, at least if you're in a colder climate, you may want to consider. We've had some questions recently about our chicken coops and sort of some of the design considerations for it. So figured this is a good time to walk through some of them because winter is not the only, but one of the sort of hardest times as far as keeping poultry. So these coops have all been designed with a few things in mind that help make our lives a little easier. Now, all of our coops are very simple. We also did a video a long time back in our YouTube history where we showed in the summer months what some of these coops look like and some of the benefits of it. So we'll link that above because obviously we can't really do justice showing that right now. So this is one of our coop styles, and this, along with all the chicken coops we have, we actually moved from our old property and repurposed them here. So there was a few tweaks made, a few changes made when they came. But for those of you who've been following us for a while, you can see the apple tree is still on top of this coop. We will hopefully be getting that off in the near future. But essentially, this is a coop style that we are planning to use in the long term, sort of as a broody coop or a grow out pen. And you'll see if I shift to the side here, it has a pen off the front and it's a double pen. So this one we've actually got the divider fence in, and that's helpful because when we're growing chicks out, we can, or the breeder flock, etc., because it does have a breeder flock in it right now, we can basically move them from side to side and sort of do a bit of rotation. It's not the same as pasture rotation, but it does give it a little bit of a rest for a week or two. So when I come in a bit closer here, what you'll notice is the doors are completely just wire. That's, I think that's 1 inch by 1 inch hardware cloth. So it doesn't necessarily keep out everything. I mean, mice can get in there, but it's completely open and our chickens have no problem with that. It's basically cowled in enough, as you can see from the sides, that there's quite a bit of protection from all the prevailing winds. And this particular coop does face south. So when the tree is not on top of it, it does get a little bit of morning sun. But that open ventilation is extremely important to the chickens. And the biggest thing is just keeping them out of the elements, but not necessarily trying to protect them and keep them warm, at least in our climate and for our breed. So when I get inside, I'm going to show some more ventilation. In the top corners, because it's just kind of a slanted roof, very simple, in the top corners, you'll see more of the hardware cloth. So these coops have tons of ventilation. Now we do try to put a plywood roof on top because that does help with condensation. But you'll see on some of our other coops where we haven't got around to that just yet. Essentially that helps with condensation and avoids accumulation of water droplets that then drop on the chickens or into the bedding. We've got 2 roosts in here. Now, one thing about our roosts, and we do have a video on this. We've used the 2x4 on its sort of broad side so that in the winter months, and nobody's going to demonstrate it today, the chickens can sort of sit down on that. Their feathers completely cover their toes, whereas a round perch will often, my hand here, essentially that keeps their toes flat, whereas the round perch they have to curl to stay on there. So we do find that is something to consider if you're in a cold climate. You'll see on this design, we also have little pop holes, and this is a bigger door when we used to use this for ducks. Ducks need bigger doors, but we left it on. So the smaller holes we find are advantageous when you let them out because nothing else can get back in, or things are reluctant to, and that includes things like ravens, other livestock, etc. So this actually butts out onto a sheep pasture. They can basically go forage in that area. And of course, it doesn't look pretty, but our nest boxes are just very simple. We do need to construct some more of those in the near future. And each coop in the winter months gets a dust bath because we do have to, at certain times of the year, leave the chickens locked in these buildings. And that certainly helps keep them in good shape. You'll also notice we just kind of do, it's sort of a deep bedding method, partially because we can't actually clean these out thoroughly through the winter months because it's too cold, and any moisture that is in here, it basically freezes. So we can really only do a thorough clean in the spring once things thaw out enough. Now, I'll show it in some other coops, but this is important with the ventilation, because the deep bedding, you will get some moisture generated. And of course, this time of year when it's cold, it's kind of irrelevant, and any moisture has the ability to escape. Aside, essentially, there isn't a lot of moisture produced. But when it starts to thaw out, that's when, if your coop doesn't have good ventilation, you can get a lot of moisture trapped in here. And that can cause a whole host of problems, from things like frostbite to respiratory issues. So that is something to think about. And as everybody's kind of calmed down a little bit, this works extremely well for this breed of chicken, which is the partridge chanticleer, because they have no cone wattles. So they are extremely cold hardy to begin with. But I have spoke to others who have breeds with big single combs and stuff, and ventilation is still key. Frostbite usually often comes from extra moisture in the coop. So having some good ventilation is super important. Another key component, and it doesn't illustrate super well in this coop because there's a bit of an overhang and we're not getting snow accumulation, but you'll notice all of our chicken coops have a bit of a lip at the door. And that's essentially for snow accumulation, so that we can get the doors open in the winter. Now, for chicks, that can be problematic, and sometimes you do have to pile some boards or something up so they can get in. But the adults have absolutely no problem with that. And if you live in an area that gets snow accumulation, having some of that lift is certainly something to consider. So before I go on to the next coops on this little tour, this is about a 4-foot width by about 12 feet long. So it's not very big. The reason it's more rectangular, because rectangles are not the best use of space, but is so that we can divide it. So even though we don't have it in there yet, we have plans to make a removable divider, or maybe a door in between there, so that if, for example, we have 2 hens go broody, each one can have their own space, because sometimes hens don't get along. The big thing here, I think, is keeping things flexible. So something you'll notice as we go on this tour is we kind of have like a little mini chicken village. And we found long ago, when you're trying to keep multiple roosters, whether you have multiple breeds or whether you have multiple lines of the same breed, when you have multiple roosters, it is nice to be able to spread them out. So that's exactly what we've done here, and we find that works well for a lot of reasons. It's a little bit more work having to go to visit all the coops, but having them spread out, it does allow us at certain times of the year to let them out to forage, etc., and not have the same competition as if they were just direct neighbors, let's say. So here's another coop design, and these are actually, again, salvaged duck coops from when we used to raise Cayuga ducks. This one's not completely finished. You'll see on this side we have one run, but there is another run that's supposed to go on this side to basically allow the birds to rotate. So we haven't quite got that far in our setup, or our resetup. This coop, of which we have 2, is kind of an odd size. They are 7 by 6. So it's a little hard to see, but the door to this coop, there is actually the same thing where we have the bit of risers underneath the door, so that allows us to get it open. And I really can't stress enough that that's a huge lifesaver, because then you're not stuck trying to chisel open doors to your coops when you need to get in to feed your chickens. But there is also a wooden platform that this sits on, which you can't really see at the moment. And all of our coops have a wooden floor. And although we don't require it here as much, that wooden floor really helps with drainage. Essentially, when we get the snow melts, you don't end up with a coop full of water. Now you'll notice on this coop and the last coop, we do use fence boards for the wall. And we find that actually allows us to be a little more, what would you call that, utilitarian, in that if we needed to put a larger animal in here, obviously after cleaning it out, we could, because they couldn't damage it. Now you can see the retrofit here, where we cowled in the outside, and you can see there's a pop hole there, and in underneath those chickens there's a pop hole on that back side. So each one of those pop holes would lead to the separate 2 yards, the divided yards. again, we have the standard dust bath mix. This coop, if you notice, over the noise of the chickens, doesn't have the plywood underside. And although we don't have any condensation now, even with the decent ventilation that's in here, we do, from time to time, get water droplets form underneath this tin. You're going to notice a theme here. I can't stress the ventilation enough. And ventilation, of course, is different from a draft. You don't want your chickens in a drafty area, but you do want some airflow. And again, this coop faces to the south. It's cowled in from the sides. So even when it's quite cold out, they're protected from the prevailing wind, so these birds are not exposed to strong winds, etc. So here's a coop, same design, identical to the last one, same ventilation, same construction, same repurposing, but you'll see we do have the 2 runs on it, and we have been taking advantage of this whenever we can. To get the birds, moving back and forth, because not so much in the winter time, but we do find in the summer there is periods where we do have to confine them, i.e. during the breeding season. We can't always let every group with a rooster out, because there would just be chaos and a whole lot of fighting. So we tend to, from a foraging perspective, take turns, and a lot of the birds, we have 4 breeding groups. Every 4 days, one of the groups gets out, and the rest of the time they get out into one of these smaller runs. And here's our last in-use chicken coop. This is the same as the very first one as far as design, and as we say, this is technically designed to be sort of a broody or a grow-out coop. You can see on the side here what I mean about the wooden floor. So these entire buildings are kind of up on garden ties, or 4x4s, depending on how we've constructed them, and that basically means that we get really good drainage. This can be a lifesaver depending on your local conditions. So as I walk back to the barn to finish up the rest of the chores, that's kind of our winter tour of our coops and what we do, and some things that we've considered over time. I think the key points to keep in mind really are ventilation. That's important. You want to have good ventilation in your coop, regardless of what kind of chicken you have. Obviously, keeping in mind cold hardiness, or hardiness to whatever elements you have, whatever weather you have, is going to be incredibly important. Another is if you live in an area where you get cold weather, in addition to ventilation, I would recommend, if you can afford it and you can make it work, putting the wood underneath your tin. Obviously, a tin roof is fantastic because it will last forever, but you will get condensation, and that condensation will drip back into your bedding and drip on your chickens, etc. And then you get into a bit of a negative spiral where you could have some issues if you don't have enough ventilation. So definitely something to consider too. Another one, if you get a lot of snow, if you're in a high snowfall area, consider raising the doors up with a little bit of a lip or a step that basically allows you to get into the coop during those periods when you've got a lot of snow. Because we can tell you from experience, and this is where we've actually retrofitted a bunch of these doors because they didn't used to be high. It absolutely sucks to have to chip out ice to get into your coop, or shovel off snow every day to get into your coop. So definitely a little trick we've learned over time. Of course, the last place that we have chickens is in the barn. And although this is not super ideal, they love it in here. The big thing for us with the chickens in the barn is we definitely would agree with sort of that old-timey notion that too many chickens can become, I think the term is offensive. They can get into a lot of trouble, and that's no fun. So we are planning to actually put a coop in the barn. It's on the table to keep one of our breeding groups, but we need a way to manage them so that they just don't have free range to whatever they want at all times. So if you are thinking about just letting your chickens free range in your barn, they're going to love it, but you might get a little tired of it because they will get into everything. So hopefully that was a good little tour and discussion on some things that we consider in our chicken coops when we have built them, and some things we've learned over the years as far as what to consider when you're housing chickens. That's the brief rundown, and all in all, most of these birds I would say are fairly happy with it.